Well, I think it was well worth the rest of it, Nick. Certainly, when you're talking about a demeaning political discourse, you try the British House of Commons at Prime Minister's Question Time. It kind of defines a demeaning political discourse, I would say.
I take it that you sometimes felt yourself demeaned there?
I've very seldom felt myself anything else. Here's some good news, because we've had with us some of the people from the other universities who are now taking this course from around the world. And actually, the things that we're debating here are things that they are debating too, in a very lively and interesting way. And so I think it's kind of good to think we're part of a broader movement. And actually, what I want to do is to build very much on what Nick has just said, because I'd just like to say I agree with it. Really? I just agree with it. And I want to try and take this debate to the next stage, because I think that the classic divide, and I found this reading the literature for what we're going to do today, the classic divide in this debate is, on the one side, religious people saying we have got the right to enforce our view against you. And then the secular liberals come back and say, keep your religion out of the public realm. And incidentally, when we analyze these things, it's not just about the Constitution, because there can be all sorts of things that are outside the Constitution that can still make a difference to how religion is viewed. I mean, for example, I don't know, and you tell me, but I think if you were an American presidential candidate and stood up and said, I don't believe in God, you'd probably find it, I mean, your campaign manager would say, I don't think you should say that. No. Your strategist and your pollster would be leaping out of their seats. So, even if it's not, sometimes religion can have an influence outside of the formal nature, but of the debate in terms of the Constitution. But the classic divide, the religious people saying we decide, the secular liberals saying get out of the public realm, I personally think you kind of moved on from that, really. Because what is clear is that, as Nick has just said, a democracy, a pluralist democracy, or let me say this, actually a pluralist society, because I think some of these things apply even to non-democratic societies that are pluralist. They require a common space where difference can be accommodated, but where certain values or norms are shared. Right, so that people are expected, irrespective of their religious commitment, whatever their own religion says about certain issues, nonetheless they accept they come on a common space at a certain point and have to expect that common space, and the values and norms are within it. So I think most people understand that, even if they're strongly religious, actually. Most people. Not everyone, but I think most do. And also, and this is where I think the thing has moved on from Rawls' time, although there are people who still come up with some quite intemperate stuff on this, but I think most people believe also that religion can't be excluded from the public realm. In other words, it's one thing to say, I as a religious thinker, I'm going to determine the public realm. It's quite another thing to say, I simply want my voice to be heard. Now that, at its minimal, I think most people would say nowadays, well, yeah, of course that's true. And incidentally, the fact is, which I would make from a practical point of view, if you are of religious belief, in a sense your religion can't be excluded. It defines you. So there is no way that you can have a public debate in which your religious view is not somehow relevant to you, and therefore relevant to the debate that is occurring within the public realm. So my view is that this debate is not really about liberal versus religious in the sense of the way that, say, O'Donovan uses it, whereas the liberal is really a sort of contractarian, I think, is that the right expression? I mean, it's to do simply with a contract, whereas the religious people are the people with the values. That is almost the suggestion I found in that writing. It seems to me that even if you take a non-religious view of human rights, nonetheless, as indeed Rawls was pointing out, behind any constitution of rights, there will lie certain ideals, and those ideals are inspired by certain values. So it isn't really true to say that the person who's a secular liberal and says, look, religion shouldn't come into this debate, is really arguing from the point of view of saying, I think this is just a personal contractual issue. It's got nothing to do with the broader society. In the same way, as I say, that in my view, most people who are religious do in fact accept that there is a common space and a common constitution, written or unwritten, to which they must conform. In addition to that, I think that no one seriously thinks nowadays that society doesn't require certain values to underpin it. I mean, whether you're religious or you're secular, most people will talk about certain values that lie behind whatever is the constitution or the legal norms to which people are expected to conform. And even the most non-religious politicians, certainly in societies like ours, I think they're not merely motivated by certain values, but they see themselves as representing certain values. And I think that people are perfectly prepared, mostly, to see those who are of religious belief at least having the right to participate in the debate, and the right to say, because how can they say otherwise, that their view of a particular debate is motivated by their religious belief. So I think it's really, when we come to this supposed very strong divide between the secular and the religious, I think most people in a way have resolved that debate in their own mind. I'm not saying there aren't still people at the extremes on either side who will say, on the religious side, no, I want to determine the way that society works. I'm not prepared to accept, my religion impels me to act in a way inconsistent with the Constitution, as Nick was explaining. I'm sure there are people like that, but there are people like that. There are people on the other side, as you saw with the statement from Jacobi, which is very much, just get out of there. You shouldn't be anywhere near this debate. But I think most people accept that society is based on certain values, and some of those values will derive from religion and some of those values won't, but there's a place often that is common and overlapping. I think the more interesting questions now are really these, however. In order to make a society work effectively, what is it that is necessary for religious and non-religious people to agree upon in order for that society to function well? Now, I agree with the two principles that Nick has just outlined, and let me try and put this in my own way and develop it somewhat. I think, first of all, that people who are secular need to understand also that the religious dimension can give a quality of a moral nature to the debate within society that can be helpful and constructive and progressive. So, for example, I would say that over the debates about Western policy in relation, let's say, to Africa and the Third World debt, the impact of those inspired by religion had a significant impact on the political decisions that were then taken by leaders. I would say that the G8, which I presided over in 2005, would never have come to its conclusions without a very strong religious movement here, back in Europe, and elsewhere in support of that. And actually one of the big changes in the whole issue to do with HIV/AIDS and how it was treated in Africa was when many of the Christian movements here decided to get over various of the sexual issues in relation to HIV/AIDS and actually embraced the notion that it was an important part of their religious duty in order to deal with this issue. And in fact, much of the healthcare that is delivered in Africa today is delivered by religious organizations. So I think, and I would, here's a very controversial area to raise this in. If you take an issue like abortion, which is very, very controversial in my society, even more so in your society, leave aside whether you agree or disagree with the positions of religious people on it. But I think that it's not unhelpful to actually have issues that are difficult like that raised in a context that is spiritually or religiously defined. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you end up with the same position of let's say, the Catholic Church on that issue or not. But I think even secular people should recognize that it's a debate that's still important to have, and it's a debate that might not have taken place in the same way unless religious people have been prepared to put it on the agenda. Now, likewise, I think that once society comes to a view, that view has to be accepted, right, by the religious people also. But all I'm saying is there are, what I think the secular people need to understand is that there can be a way of raising questions. This is where I do agree with O'Donovan, a way of raising questions and actually the establishment of an agenda in which religious and spiritual thought can play a part and can play a positive part. Because otherwise some issues would not get raised at all. You know, I think, for example, of the work done by many church organizations in relation to the disabled. Now, it's true there are many people who are not religious at all that raise these issues, but I would have to say, certainly in my society, some of the most extraordinary and selfless work is done by religious organizations in this sphere. So that's the first thing. The second thing, however, and I think the concomitant obligation, is that people who are religious also need to understand that those who do not conform to a view derived from religious belief nonetheless have equal validity to state that belief, adhere to it, and advocate it. And this is where, if you like, the concept of faith-friendly democracy or democracy-friendly faith is so important. You need that balance if you're going to achieve a proper settlement of the place of religion within society. But I think this is not just about democracy. I mean, I just want to make this amendment, in a sense, to our discussion. I think it is possible to have a non-democratic, certainly the sense of non-democratic in a Western sense, a political system that nonetheless is pluralist and nonetheless has the same relationship that I'm describing between religious faith and politics. What is essential is the notion of pluralism. In other words, if you don't have the question of pluralism, the issue of pluralism there, that concept rooted in the society, then I think it's very difficult. And so my view is that this very, what I would call quite extreme, almost slightly old-fashioned sense of a divide between those people who say, my religion entitles me to enforce my view against you, and those people who say, actually, you take your religious views out of here, we don't want anything to do with that, and it's not a legitimate basis upon which you can put your case. I think that is largely people, as I say, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I don't think that's what most people find difficult today. Most people can accept that the religious people have a right to express their view. Most religious people can accept that they don't have the right to enforce it. I think the question is, though, what are the conditions that give rise to that faith-friendly society and society-friendly faith? And those, in my view, are, as I say, that the secular needs to understand the religious can actually enrich the social and moral dialogue of a nation, and the religious need to understand that those who aren't religious have equal validity in their views. The question, to my mind, then becomes the practical question of how do you best create such societies? And here's where I think, the political, the social, and the faith conditions for such societies are an interesting subject of analysis and discussion, because, and it may be just because of my background, I kind of think it's interesting to analyze a question, and it's even more interesting to find an answer to the question. And so what is it that gives rise to this? Because I can describe and just have what are the attitudes, but how do you encourage those attitudes? How do you embed those attitudes? And here's where I think that the policy, in a sense, that flows from this is as follows. I think, to begin with, there does need to be some clear constitutional or legal framework within which this is set. And the four principles that Nick outlined that lay behind the US Constitution, those, undoubtedly helped create the sense in the US today that there is a legitimate and an illegitimate way of having the debate between religion and politics. So I think that is important. I think, secondly, none of this will work without action to support it. I think what we're talking about has radical implications, for example, for our education system, and in particular the way that religion is taught within our education system, within civic society, within international engagement. For example, the Alliance of Civilizations concept put forward by Turkey and Spain and in some process of development now is actually important in this regard. And so if we want to create that society in which there is the balance of the proper space for religion to make its view clear, but also the broader polity that must encompass more than the religious, I think it requires that constitutional framework. It requires policy on behalf of government that supports such attitudes. And the third thing that it needs, and this is which touches directly on our faith and globalization course, is it does require a certain attitude of mind. And this is where I find it's quite interesting just listening to Nick's analysis of the way that the intellectual debate has gone. In the end, what this requires is what I would call an open rather than closed attitude to both the process of globalization and to the society in which we live. And how you inculcate that attitude has also got to be part of the discourse in and around this subject. Because, you see, ultimately, in order for this balance to work, in order for us to be able to say, as Nick has really outlined for you, that you should not exclude the religious has a place and a voice, but nonetheless that is within certain rules and with certain qualifications to how that voice should be spoken. In order to do that, And in order to have a society work like that, there needs to be within the people in that society a certain openness to the other. So that, for example, someone who is religious is not merely not exclusivist towards those of other religions, but is actually prepared to acknowledge that the secular can sometimes have something to say to the religious world. But it also requires, and actually this is often, I think, far more resisted, that those that are secular should also realize that those who are religiously inspired have something to offer and to add to the forum within which political debate is conducted. So to summarize, my view is this, that this is, I think there is a developing consensus that you do require faith-friendly democracy and democracy-friendly faith, or faith-friendly society, society-friendly faith. The question is how you achieve such a thing, and in order to achieve it, you need a combination of the right constitutional framework, the right policy, and the right attitude.